Hello everyone, welcome to the Green Man channel. Hope you're all doing good and well. So in following on from the kind of two-part review I did of the two Silent Hill films, I'm carrying on in a similar vein here. This time I'm actually tackling two films from a similar kind of era in the 2000s, and the first of these two films I'll be discussing is called The Descent, directed by Neil Marshall. And then also I will be talking about The Descent Part 2 as well, the sequel, directed by John Harris. So to begin with, I'm going to discuss The Descent, the original film, which is widely regarded and revered as a modern horror classic film. I think I would be in that camp as well. If you saw me doing an all-time kind of countdown of my favourite horror films, there's a very good chance The Descent would appear pretty high up in that list. I think it is a really extremely well directed and executed film that is most effective in how it makes you feel claustrophobic, with the narrow tunnels that these girls are kind of trying to work their way through and trying to find a way out of this cave system that they've become trapped in. The claustrophobia and the use of camera angles, the acting is fantastic as well. Particularly, I think the lead, Sean McDonald, is brilliant in this movie, and that really carries a lot of weight throughout the film, because the other thing that it does really well is suspense building. You won't perhaps see many horror films that do suspense building, particularly modern day horror films that do suspense building as well as The Descent did in 2005. In fact, you don't really see the first kind of major horror scene, unless you count the car accident at the very start of the film. You don't see the first major horror scene really until about 50-55 minute mark. But that shows, I think, the strength of this film in the way that it does build up and suspense. It's not necessarily a bad thing that you have to wait that long. Believe me, when the horror hits, it hits in a pretty chaotic and fantastic edge of your seat way that has you completely gripped. So that tension and that suspense building is extremely effective and well done by Neil Marshall. As I say, the acting's great. The characters are deep. You have a really good background to Sarah's story. You have pretty good backgrounds to other characters as well. I quite like Beth. I like Juno and how her story links. I'm not going to probably give away too many major spoilers. I'll try and avoid them, but I will put a spoiler warning anyway. But the link between Juno and Sarah makes for some real tension and drama as the film goes through its paces, particularly towards the end. And I quite liked the sisters. Actually, the sisters, the way they were killed off has kind of stayed with me. I thought that was kind of disturbing. With one of them, ended up hanging from the ceiling as she's trying to climb her way across to safety, I think, in one of the caves. And the other one is kind of really quite viciously has her kind of gut torn into, and that's a pretty nasty scene as well. Two of the more memorable ones from the kind of horror scenes in this film anyway. But yeah, I mean, what a fantastic film in so many ways. It rightly is revered as a classic. I cannot argue with that in any way whatsoever. The Descent Part 1. If you've never seen this, definitely check it out. Particularly as it's kind of Halloween anyway. Great film to watch. Good scares, effective suspense building, and suitably unsettling for Halloween. So that's Descent Part 1, if you like. Now, The Descent Part 2, this John Harris one, really not well liked at all, pretty disliked. I would say, it has a 5.8 rating out of 10 on IMDb. I don't think it's a bad film, actually. And that might be very controversial with a lot of people, that I'm just saying it's not that bad a film. I would say, compared to when I was doing my Silent Hill films, I definitely prefer this Part 2 to the Silent Hill sequel that we had. It certainly struggles a bit to achieve the same level of character depth in this film. We don't really get a background to the characters apart from maybe Ellen. Rios, I think her surname was, who they call her in the film. And that is where the film suffers a bit more, because as an audience you're not really so invested in those characters as you were in the first film, and so the sequel fails like so many other horror sequels do. They fail to give a depth to the characters, and therefore when they're killed off you don't really give, you don't really give a damn, to be frank. But what the second film does do pretty well still are the horror scenes. And the suspense building actually is still there a bit. I mean, again, I don't think the first kill is really until quite far into the movie, maybe this time at the 35-40 minute mark again, or this time round. And we have, I think, 5 or 6 characters here: Greg, Kath, Ellen, the sheriff, Vanes, I think his name is, and Dan, along with Sarah, and of course, spoiler alert, give you a chance to cut out if you want to, but we have Juno returning as well later on in this movie too, which is an interesting decision. Wasn't entirely against it, but I'm not sure I liked it, and whether, it did add a layer to the film towards the end, which I suppose gave it another dynamic perhaps for the audiences to enjoy, but I wasn't so sure about the decision personally. But as I say, there were some really good horror sequences. The two that strike me in this film, that might be the ones you remember if you remember anything from this film, which you might not, as it's not as clever maybe as the first film was in certain respects. But for Greg, I think it was Greg and Kath. And actually, I liked the way this film was somewhat faithful to the first film, in how you discovered some of the previous characters, their dead bodies, okay, but I liked how they were placed in the same way, so there weren't inconsistencies in that respect. When they discovered Sam dangling from the ceiling, the poor girl, and I think it's Kath who Greg suggests, she uses her to try and get across the other side of the cavern, or the chasm even. And that doesn't go terribly well. They get attacked by crawlers, and Greg is quite heroic. He actually kills one of them and then leaps across to take one of the crawlers that is tugging on tugging on Kath, who is hanging on to Sam. So Greg, he leaps across the chasm to relieve Kath of the weight that she has, pulling on her legs, and sacrifices himself basically in order to save Kath. And that's a really good scene, I think, personally. Actually, that was one of the more kind of entertaining parts of this film. But then Kath, after all of that, and Dan, is it Greg or Dan? I get the two mixed up. I think it was Greg. After his sacrifice, Kath then stupidly shouts, which of course attracts the crawlers to her, and she doesn't last too long after that either. The other memorable, I think, scene was probably the scene where, stupidly the sheriff has cuffed himself to Sarah because he thinks, she's very dangerous and everything. But in a cavern, in a system of caves like that, such a stupid thing to do. And with those crawlers around that he himself seen, I think at that point, what a crazy decision. And the guy, when he gets killed off, we don't have much sympathy for him really, although it was a pretty brutal way to go, with his wrist being severed so that the girls could basically get free. I mean, I thought otherwise I might have had a bit of sympathy in that kind of situation, but cuffing himself it was just such a daft thing to do. And so I don't think probably most viewers would have had too much sympathy for that character when he went. So overall, I'm not sure, maybe a 6 out of 10 for part 2, an 8 out of 10 at least for part 1, gotta say. But part 2, not so good, but not the terrible film people would call it at all. No, I don't think it's that bad a film. So there you go. There's my thoughts on Descent, parts 1, part 2. Where do you fall with these films? What do you think of these ones? Do you think that they are? Do you agree the first one is a classic, first of all, and do you think the second one's a little bit maybe underrated, perhaps? Otherwise, I hope you enjoy what's left of the weekends. and I'll leave it there. So take care, everybody. Bye for now.